you very much for coming. Hope you're enjoying the virtual conference. We certainly had a great time in San Francisco in the live conference. We look forward to seeing you all in Chicago next year. But since this is the 20th annual conference, the first one was in 2022, thought it might be useful to have a time of reflection. So that's the title of this talk. I like this title for a variety of different reasons. Number one, it's pretension disguised as erudition, right? So, but also it captures a couple of different ideas. You know, there's allusions to two of my favorite media, music, the Moody Blues album, Days of Future Past, and of course, then there's the X-Men. This particular graphic is, we were in San Francisco. This is the past in San Francisco that you might be able to get a little bit of in the future, but it's mostly there. The idea is if we go back in the past, we can kind of project into the future. But it's also an allusion to something for those of you who were not born before 1980, which is probably the bulk of people. It also is an allusion to the X-Men. And that, there's the Moody Blues. So they just look out of time, don't they? And then the next slide is the X-Men. Now, I like this particular slide because if you look all the way to your left, that guy looks a little bit like me in the 2002 TCOM conference. But anyway, it's not. But the X-Men, that's a modern version of them going back in the past to look at the future. So anyway, that's what we're about. So let's start with the origin story. Why TCOM? What is it about? Where does it come from? So its origin story is actually back in the late 70s and early 80s. So I was one of the first NIMH-funded postdoctoral fellows in an emerging field called mental health services research. So at the time, NIMH was trying to get this field going, to get people develop professionals. My training was in clinical psychology and statistics, so I had kind of the background they're looking for. And I took a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago with Don Fisk and Daryl Mock. I'd been right to begin to learn what is this about. And what struck me at the time, the most vivid experience in those first few years as I was digging into it, is really what mental health services was and sort of is. Mental health services research is taking large administrative data sets and then beating it to death with different regression analyses, right? So you have all this data that you collect as a part of routine care, and you try to use that to make policy and practice sense out of it. Now, the problem is with those data sets, however, is that they had only a little bit of information about people. They'd have maybe age, maybe gender, maybe race, diagnosis, or up to like 6. That was it. And at the time, there's a whole literature on the unreliability of chart diagnoses, and so you're not even supposed to use that. So the scientists among us would say, oh, no, you got to use objective data. You can't use anything that's subjective. So it led to what the vast majority of the information in those large administrative data sets was a focus on not people, but what we do with people, services. And those, of course, are motivated by billing. So people said, oh, these are reliable because people get paid by this, et cetera, et cetera. So my thought at the time is this is wrong. And my thought now is that it's incredibly misleading for most of the policy and research that we've done in this kind of application of using large administrative data sets is you don't have any representation of people. So most mental health policy for the last 50 years or more has been driven by what we do with people and not with anything about those people. So I set about my goal in my career. I decided, let's change that. Let's figure out how to do this so that we can actually have meaningful information about people in large administrative data sets so we can actually understand systems from a personal level, about clinic. I thought I would describe it at the time as a clinical level, a clinical understanding of people. But the problem is, of course, is what researchers do, right? Is, oh, I have these validated instruments. You just have to ask these 90 questions in the same order, always the same to everybody at a certain moment in time that's uniform, blah, blah, blah. And that's how you do science. And we're going to push this into the system. And the system would just push back and say, this is a bunch of bullshit. We don't want to do this. This is an intrusion. I met with some family members that are calling the Achenbach, the awful Bach, because it was just so burdensome to have to fill out those 90 questions and then do it again in a few months and so forth, the same 90 questions. Like, what is this? Anyway, so it was ill-advised and really actually unfair to expect people who are already busy to add on stuff to just do research, right? So you need to rethink how things work. How do you actually think about information? How do you think about collecting information? How do you think about using information? And so that's really the origin story, because that's the start of the journey, and it's really got morphed into something completely unexpected, I think. Go to the next slide, Ari. By the way, Ari did these slides. They're in Canva. She's amazing. I'm gobsmacked. So we've had some success, right? In terms of actually, once you figure it out, once you say, okay, instead of forcing research into practice, let's try and capture practice. Let's try and understand what practice is, and then how information is used in practice, and then collect information that's relevant to practice to the people we're trying to help, and use that information and push it up. So instead of a top-down way of thinking about measurement, it's let's start with the people that we're trying to help and measure up from that, or out from that, or around from that, or whatever the right preposition is. So you can see there's actually widespread use. We have there might be implementations of TCOM now in the Netherlands and Sweden coming up. England is robust. We had a number of people from TCOM England involved in this year's conference. Welcome, Mark and Sibby and George and the gang. And so there's quite a bit of use. So we now have a different sort of circumstance where we do have actually access to large amounts of information about people embedded within information about what we've done in working with them. So got the next slide. So this is in the United States, since most of participants are in the US. It needs to be updated a little bit because it's a fast-moving slide. The blue is statewide implementations in at least one sector. Many of these states have multi-sector implementations. The stars are when there's decision support models that are in practice if it's a gold star, and in outline if it's a one in the middle of implementation or development. So there's a lot of use of the tool and actually quite a few implementations around decision support. On the next slide. That gives us an opportunity, right? It gives us an opportunity to have shared learning. So that's one of the purposes of the conference, is to bring people together. Like, I got to hear exactly how Illinois is thinking about well-being and well-becoming as a part of how they end up managing and organizing their child welfare system, right? They're using indicators pulled from the cans that any of you could use, right, to develop their metrics, to then evolve their system with a more balanced focus on safety, purpose, and well-being. And you can't manage what you don't measure. So since we've got so many different people who are involved in this so much and have spent some big part of their lives doing this kind of stuff, we do have, I think, some lessons learned. Now, this is sort of, I did the royal we, I apologize. This is sort of my take on what we've learned. I'm sure that there's other people who have different kinds of experiences, etc. So, but this is my view. So number one, implementing person-centered assessment processes by themselves is transformation. So in other words, if you do assessments with people, they experience their discovery process completely different than if you are applying measures to them. So the idea of collaborative assessment, the idea of having people embed their voice into the output of the measurement scheme is really important. And by itself, it's useful to just do that, just doing that. So we've had some implementations that have never gotten past that, but have still been sustainable for years because, in fact, doing person-centered assessment is the right thing to do with people. So at the individual level, it makes sense. People like it. It ends up making it sustainable. It's also the area where it's difficult, right? I'd say actually one of the most challenging aspects of this worldwide implementation is routinely getting people to use these tools in the fashion that they're designed to be used as collaborative assessments. That's hard because people are not used to that. They're very used to expert systems where, I'm the expert. I went to school. I got my degree. And so I'll tell people what I think. And I don't want to mess that up by hearing what they think, right? And so doing collaborative assessment, it takes a minute for some folks to figure out how to do this well and how to do it in a way that is congruent with their own identity. But once you figure it out, and different people figure it out for different reasons at different times, but everybody can figure it out, it's actually then very helpful. But it's extremely difficult to get this transition to occur. It's very difficult. It's the ultimate form of cat herding because it's what happens behind closed doors with people, and that you don't have a whole lot of control. You just have a lot of moral authority, and it's the right thing to do, and evidence that this actually is going to help you be more effective. When you look then at systems, so once you get people to actually use it, and then you move away from just doing it. So one of the biggest challenges is doing it versus using it. But once you get people to use it, sometimes even just doing it, when you start compiling the information, when you look at systems from a person-centered perspective, it changes things, and it changes things in a fairly dramatic fashion. And we'll talk a little bit about that coming up. Strengths are very important. The other thing we're learning is strengths are very important. But they appear to be more complex as we dig deeper into how strengths work and what their relationship is to needs and to well-being and to healthy, living your best life. They're complicated. It's not quite so straightforward that, strengths are good, right? So it's more complicated than that. And I think as we unfold this onion, I think we're going to learn that actually good public behavioral health, good child welfare, good justice interventions are all about strength building, that the most sustainable outcomes in all helping sectors is building resilience. And that in fact, much of what we're doing is not necessarily about addressing needs. It's about teaching people how to live with their needs and be happy, healthy, safe, able to pursue their dreams, despite the fact that they do have some ongoing and perpetual challenges like most of us do. All right. But that's a really different way of thinking about the system than here's a disease, here's a treatment, but done, you're cured, and now you don't have the disease. I don't think that's actually what's going on. And I think the data is beginning to show that it's much more complicated than that. All right, next slide. I love that. I love the little girl riding a bicycle. She's learning, by the way, just like we are. All right. So we've talked about this, and the biggest problem with this is that we do have to figure out two things. One, is there some way that we can streamline documentation so we're not abusing people who choose to become helpers by giving them excessive and redundant documentation processes? So, the estimates are upwards of a third of all direct help time in the public sector is spent on documentation. That's absurd, right? There's no reason why we can't shift into a system in which the work and the documentation of the work is the same thing. That's the original fantasy of EHRs, et cetera, they haven't walked the walk, haven't lived that dream because they get stuck in traditional ways of thinking about information as opposed to re-engineering the information to fit the flow of the work and streamlining things. So a lot of people in the TCOM world are working on this. And how do you figure out a way to take, one-stop shopping? If you need information about people, this is in your TCOM tool, and you can use that to report to the feds or report to your supervisor or give it back to the people that you're trying to help to encourage them to understand their own journey. So, but that's hard. It's very hard, but it's really, really important. The structural problems that have resulted from excessive, redundant, and disorganized documentation is a threat to the integrity of our work. And so helping people work through that, that's on all of us, and we all have to figure out how to get together and make the compromises that are necessary in order to achieve the dream of efficiency. Right, next slide, please. So one of the things, and I had some debates with folks at the conference live about this issue, is when you look at the systems from a person-centered perspective, complexity does drive intensity. So if you're looking at who utilizes more services and so forth, it's really about complexity, not severity. So it's not a severe depression, it's a depression that is associated with suicidality, sleep problems, functional impairment, not going to work, not going to school, those kinds of things. The complexity of it is what challenges the system and requires a more intensive strategy of intervention. So it's not really that just how severe it is, it's how complex it is, how many different things are going on. And it appears actually like there's two forms of complexity, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And in terms of the complexity of strengths, so just to give you an example of one of the things we're finding, in general, spiritual religious strengths appear to be good, right? So kids in child welfare who have spiritual religious strengths tend to do better than kids who don't in terms of their needs. However, as the number of adverse childhood experiences increases, there comes a tipping point. For a while, with low levels of ACEs, spiritual religious strengths are positive. But at a certain moment, they actually stop having any potency, and they can't even become associated with bad outcomes. So we think, if you want to describe that phenomenon, that's the statistical phenomenon. But if you want to describe it kind of in words, you might say, at a certain moment, youth who are deeply religious and spiritual say, why is God doing this to me? What have I done to deserve this? That after a certain level of accumulation of traumatic experiences, which then suggests that how we think about faith-based interventions in this kind of space is going to depend a little bit, right? Because you need something different. One thing is encouraging involvement in the spiritual religious community. The other, with more complex trauma, that's a very different kind of intervention. And in general, what we're finding is that strengths and pieces are frequently called, we call them strengths, but CDC describes positive childhood experiences. I think a lot of that is the politics of, we always end up defining stuff in the negative, right? So we've got this ACEs thing, that's bad, so let's have something good, let's have the pieces thing, the positive childhood experiences, whatever. There is this accumulative effect for both of them. So the more ACEs you have, the worse your outcomes. The more pieces you have, the more positive experiences, the better your outcomes. So Charlotte Tong and Hae-Yoon Shin from our group have been looking at the complementarian, the dynamic relationship between these phenomena. And what they're finding is absolutely fascinating. It depends on the outcome. It depends on the behavioral emotional need, what the relationship between adverse and positive experiences are. So for instance, because they both have cumulative effects. For anger, you can overwhelm ACEs with pieces. So in other words, with enough positive experiences, it doesn't matter what's happened in your life, you will be not angry. You can overwhelm the adverse. So no matter how many ACEs you might have experienced, if you have enough positive experiences, it counterbalances so that there's no anger problem. Not true for anxiety. For anxiety, it's not that. So no matter how many positive experiences you have, if you have an accumulation of adverse experiences, you will be higher and higher likelihood that you struggle with anxiety, right? So there's these complex relationships on these things. So you can't just say strengths are good. Strengths are useful. Positive experiences are useful in certain circumstances for certain things. And then probably clinical interventions are critical for other things and other circumstances. And we need to be able to be sufficiently nuanced in how we talk about that. So it's not this kind of all or nothing kind of binary stuff. It is not binary, of course, as nothing is. So, all right, next slide. So this is an example. So this is from Olga Shablowska. Anyway, Olga. She is, as and Wiley Turner, a number of other folks, predicted utilization using the cans. So they use complexity, right? So there's individual items, they created a model. And in fact, just as we'd expect, the more complex kids are, the more services they utilize. So once you have that curve, you can look at kids who experience less than what you'd predict and kids who experience more than what you'd predict. So if you have kids who are having more utilization than you would predict, that's called overutilization, right? That's what managed care is designed to do, right? We don't want people to use services unnecessarily, right? And then if you have fewer, then that's underutilization. That's not sufficiently engaged in all likelihood. So as you can see from this curve, that dotted line and up at the 45-degree angle about is the relationship between complexity and utilization. So you can see it's the more complex, the more you use. And you also see that there's not a single child that's receiving more than is predicted based on the complexity. So there's no overutilization whatsoever in this community-based intensive treatment sample. There is, however, significant underutilization. Now, why that's an interesting observation that comes from a person-centered perspective is, for the longest time, services researchers just do high utilizers versus low utilizers. What's the problem with that? Well, the high utilizers maybe are appropriate. And so we save money by reducing high utilizers. That might be an exceedingly bad idea. And this data suggests it is. That in fact, using more intensive community services is not gold bricking, as I talked about in the IFBOM about this, right? It's not gold bricking to go see people twice a week or have people come into your home. You do what you need, and you don't really want this help unless you really need it. And so this begins to say, oh, wait a minute, our focus, our managed care focus on cost containment and preventing overutilization is a waste of money, because people don't use more than they need, because who wants to have interventions if you don't need it? That money, actually, if you want to have an effective system, would be better spent preventing low utilization. All right, next slide. So these are projections. If you got to see any of the latent class analysis stuff, you can begin to pick people in multi-dimensional space. So in a 50-dimensional space, there are actually over 2 quadrillion different locations of, that's the full profile, right? So there's more locations if you take an ANSA or a CANS and project them out onto this 50-dimensional space, there's more locations than there are people who have ever walked the face of the earth, right? So they're potentially unique, but there's neighborhoods in those spaces. And so you can use how people are more like each other than less like each other to identify it. So these are 2-dimensional projections from this 50-dimensional space to look at how things work. This is demonstrating that there's 2 types of complexity. This is from health homes in New York State. And for the horizontal axis is social complexity, and the vertical axis is what I might call clinical complexity. And what we've learned in working with the health homes, we're basing their case management rates, there are expectations for intensive case management based on complexity, but there's these two different kinds of complexity. So social complexity is, do you have homelessness and poverty, and do you have problems with school and the legal system, all these other kinds of stuff, right? Clinical complexity is, do you have to see an oncologist, an endocrinologist, a pediatrician, and a radiologist, and then you also have PT, OT, and you have a feeding tube, and you need help with positioning on your bed. So, that's complex, and you may be no social. The family may be doing fine. They may be wealthy and stable, but that's still really complex, right? And so there's two different kinds of complexity. So you need to build that into how we think about complex in the model. And you can see that when you start looking at people from this out in the cloud, if you will, this 60-dimensional space, you begin to see that there's these different locations that are related to different constructs. On the next slide. So I think you might have noticed if you went to any of the data things that we use a lot of visualizations, because I think we're moving away from statistical significance as a meaningful construct and into visual significance. So this is the original decision support model at a particular stage. Show me the next slide, please. And this is a revised model. You see it's much cleaner, right? Much greater separation between the three levels. That's visual significance. All right. That's the future, because everything is statistically significant, right? It's a difference the size of a gnat's ass is statistically significant when you have tens of thousands of data. All right. So, and the next slide, please. So this is what I envision for the future. I think we're going to continue to evolve in person-centered care. We're going to refine our concepts of strengths, and we're going to identify strategies for helping people find their strengths and build them. We're going to figure out how to streamline documentation so it's not excessive. I think the machine learning kinds of techniques with large data sets is the future. And there's all sorts of really, really innovative kinds of AI-related approaches that will help us do a better job. I think we'll continue to add partners. And I think ultimately we are going to be shifting from a disease care system to a system based on wellness or well-becoming. I think that is, in fact, the future. So I'm going to wrap up here. Now, as some of you might know, I have an aspiration of spending an entire day speaking only in song lyrics. So I'm tempted, so I'm going to close with one. I'm tempted to use the one many of you have heard, which, what a long, strange trip it's been, but I'm not going to. I'm going to use a different quote that I think fits the moment, which is, sleeping horses, heave away. Lay your backs to the golden hay. Don't ever look behind at what you've done, for your work has just begun. There'll be the evening in the end. Until that time arrives, you can rest your eyes and begin again. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for all that you do to help others. We do have an event I wanted to highlight. The Alliance Against Harmful Anger is having its first event on November 1st. We're trying to, it's very clear from our data, as well as anybody who's paying any attention to anything on social media or anywhere, that anger is a problem for us culturally. And so we want to help people learn to channel their anger to productive outlets. So if you were at the live conference, we had Richie Daitches Barlow come, and he has a amazing story. He was horrific beginning, incredible resolution, but he was trafficked as a young man, and he talked very eloquently about how he was actually exploited in a pedophile ring by rich old men in England when he was about 9 to 12. Anyway, it's multiple. And he talks about, there was, of course, rage, but how he channeled that anger to break the cycle of violence and abuse in his family. So it's a really interesting phrase, but so it is possible, but you do have to figure ways to channel your anger into productive kinds of positive output. Anyway, so thank you for all you do. Thank you for participating, and I look forward to seeing you all down the road.